evening, guys. I'm really emotional tonight. It just hits me randomly, but I just feel the presence of the Holy Spirit so present here tonight, and definitely with the worship songs, the lyrics and things, they speak to me. Those were actually some of my top three favorite songs, and just to think about the goodness of God. And I had someone ask me yesterday, Ramona, don't you get tired of sharing your testimony? And I said, how could I ever get tired of glorifying God? You can't. You can never tire of the wonderful things that God has done in your life. And so I could never tire of giving him glory, because what has happened to me is quite remarkable. And I realized that, at the time, you don't think, you don't know, you don't see God's plan for yourself. You just are going through the motions until you realize that you were created for such a time as this. And I realized that this is where God wanted me, and this is why he used 40 Days for Life in my life to convert me so that I could now represent and be the director of outreach for 40 Days for Life and do this. And it's pretty remarkable to think where God has led me all over the globe throughout the last 14 years of my life. So I am the Director of Outreach, as I mentioned, Director of Outreach with 40 Days for Life. For those of you that may not be really familiar with how 40 Days for Life functions, we were founded in 2007, officially went nationally and internationally organized in 2007, but 40 Days for Life started in 2004 in Bryan College Station in response to a Planned Parenthood that had opened up in 1998. Very near Texas A&M University. So they're very strategic about placing themselves near universities, near high schools, and that sort of thing. So in 1998, this Planned Parenthood opened up. The pro-life community responded and tried to, keep them from opening. Then they were out on the sidewalk counseling, praying, condemning, doing everything that they, could think to do to try to get women to get out of there and not have abortions. And they saw that nothing they did made a difference, and that more women kept going in, right? And in 2004, a group of four that were part of the Brazos Valley Coalition for Life, they sat down around a round table and they started praying to God for guidance on what to do and how to respond and how they could make an impact on this Planned Parenthood and really just see, an impact on the abortion numbers. And so they prayed, and the number 40 kept coming up over and over again, and how God has used, the number 40 throughout salvation history to change things, right? And so they came up with this idea of 40 days of prayer and fasting. So they gave it a whirl, and that was in 2004. They had their first, quote unquote, 40 Days for Life vigil. And it was a 24-hour vigil, round the clock, nonstop. I think it ended up being like 960 hours for the duration of that 40 days. So an unending chain of prayer, and people came out in droves and participated in that. And they saw a remarkable 28% decrease in the abortions that were happening. So they thought, wow, maybe we're onto something here, right? And so then I think it was like 7 cities in the U.S. that first heard about this, because it made national and news and local news and stuff like that, and statewide news. And so some other cities caught on, and so they participated in the year to follow. And then in 2007, they ended up spreading to becoming a nationally and internationally. I say internationally because Canada was actually the first one to join. And so it was like 33 cities across 13 states, I believe. And so, actually, no, I have that reversed. It was 89 cities in 33 states during that first 2007 campaign. And so that's when, it started taking off. And I don't think that when, our president and CEO, Sean Carney, I don't think that he would have ever imagined back in 2004 and 2007 that it would reach the heights that it has, and really, it's truly remarkable to see that this is truly the work of God in this ministry, because as of right now, this is our largest 40 Days for Life campaign. It's our largest spring campaign with 660 cities worldwide. We have had a campaign in all 6 populated continents. I think right now in Europe, there's about 17 countries Mexico and Latin America, there's over 200 cities, and then of course in the U.S. and Canada. So it's pretty remarkable to see what God has done and how this has grown. And so it's a perfect fit for me to be part of the 40 Days for Life team, because 40 Days for Life is so near and dear to my heart because it was instrumental in my conversion. So I obviously, you would imagine that the most common question I get asked is, how did you end up at Planned Parenthood? Planned Parenthood is the U.S.'s largest abortion perpetrator. They are responsible for over 300,000 abortions every year. They receive more than $500 million in tax and federal tax funding, nonprofit organization that gets federal tax funding, right? So how does that work, right? But so this is a very large abortion giant organization. And I did not really know any history about Planned Parenthood. This is where, my people perish for lack of knowledge comes into play, because I did not know anything about Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood was not synonymous with abortion to me. I am from a very small rural town in North Texas, so about an hour north of Dallas, if you kind of know your Texas geography at all, which I don't expect you to. But I'm about an hour north of the big city. Population less than 1,000 people. That's my hometown. My family has been there for over 100 years. My great-grandparents immigrated from Mexico and settled in that small town. And so we've been there ever since, and I never left. And so there I grew up in this little town where, everyone knows everyone. We don't really deal with the big city issues. I was like living in my own little bubble, right? But my childhood wasn't that great. I come from an alcoholic family household. And I was baptized as a Catholic. My sister and I were both baptized as Catholics, but we were culturally Catholic. We weren't living out our faith at all. My parents weren't living their faith. We didn't have any formation in our faith. And so no surprise, I became pregnant at the age of 16. And you can imagine that in a town where everybody knows everybody, it's quite a scandal, right? To be pregnant and everyone knows, is gonna know. But praise be to God, I never considered abortion. It was, when we talk about wanting to make abortion unthinkable, it really was unthinkable. It never crossed my mind. And praise be to God, my parents never considered it for me either. And I realized what a blessing that is, today looking back, because so many young girls that were in my position, the first thing their parents are gonna do is take them down to the abortion facility and take care of it, right? And so despite my parents' own personal struggles in their marriage and their own problems, they recognized the humanity in their own grandbaby in my womb. And I also recognized that in that moment that I became, that I saw my pregnancy test positive, I knew, that I was a mother. And I knew that I wasn't pregnant with a what, but a who, which was my child. Sadly, the father of my daughter, wanted me to have an abortion. And again, thanks be to God, I didn't listen. I didn't, go through with anything like that. But I think as a result, he resented me, and then I was subjected to many years of abuse at his hands, until God gave me the courage to walk away from that relationship and face my life as a single mother. And so, when I think about when people ask, how did you get up at Planned Parenthood? I think that that plays a huge part in it, because there's a lot of trauma that I had experienced that I never dealt with. And I always see that, there's this component there where Satan really knows how to capitalize on our trauma. He knows how to capitalize on any wounds that we have that are left unhealed. And that's why our healing is so important, to be able to be healed by Christ so that Satan doesn't find a way in. And so I think that's really where he found that way in, because I had never dealt with any of that trauma. I ended up meeting my now husband of 18 years, and we were married, and we entered into the faith, and we were married in the Catholic Church. But again, it was more cultural. It wasn't really that we were, looking for that relationship with Christ. And so we were married, and then 2 years later is when the opportunity presented itself to work for Planned Parenthood, and I accepted. And I accepted that position mainly because I saw it as an opportunity. I saw it as an opportunity to prove that I had what it took to be the clinic director. But it also fit with my personal lifestyle. So I had At that point, my husband and I, we had yours, mine, and ours. So he and I both had daughters from previous relationships. And then when we got married, we had our first son together. And he was a toddler, and I was kind of ready to get back into the workforce. And so when this opportunity presented itself, it was only a three-day-a-week job. So I thought, oh, this is perfect, right? I can balance this with my personal life. And there's just this nice work and personal life balance, right? And the other reason that I accepted is because abortions didn't happen on site. So our Planned Parenthood affiliate, so the way they have it is they have the PPFA, which is the Planned Parenthood Federation of America, and then each kind of region has their own affiliate. And we had an affiliate called Planned Parenthood of North Texas that had, I think it was probably like 26 or 27 total facilities, and 2 of those were the surgical centers where women went to get their medical and surgical abortions, or I would say chemical and surgical abortions. And then the other, 24, 25 facilities were family planning clinics, right? And so we were referring the women to those surgical centers. And that's really how I justified working for Planned Parenthood, based off of the fact that, well, this isn't happening here, it's happening over there, and I could easily ignore it. Which I think this is the problem in our society. That's part of where the apathy comes in and the indifference is because it's out of sight, out of mind. This is not happening to me. I'm not being faced with this issue. This is someone else's decision, someone's choice, right, to make, and therefore it's not happening right here. And so that was kind of the attitude that I had was, well, I personally wouldn't have an abortion. I personally, maybe don't agree with it necessarily. But you know what? It's a woman's right to choose. That is part of the conditioning, right, and the indoctrination that we've been conditioned to believe. Because I grew up in a Roe v. Wade culture where abortion was legal, and that is all I ever heard were the euphemisms of choice. And now we're hearing the euphemisms of health care and reproductive rights, right? So all of these euphemisms. And so I was growing up in that type of culture where this is about choice and a woman's right to choose. But I had never really stopped to consider what is that choice, right? What does that choice look like? What exactly is happening when we think about the choice? So that's really kind of the mental gymnastics that were happening in order for me to kind of suppress the feelings or the personal feelings that I had or any type of alarms that were going off in my mind, any type of like poking from the Holy Spirit, like, hey, Ramona, maybe you should reconsider, working here. I ignored it. That was the way I solved that problem. I ignored it. And really it was kind of like Pontius Pilate. I was like Pontius Pilate. I washed my hands of innocent blood and said, that's something they're doing. That's their choice. I have nothing to do with it, right? But what I could not ignore what was going on in front of me, right? So you would think, okay, well, you're ignoring the abortion part, right? And so everything should be fine, but it wasn't fine. Because I had gone into Planned Parenthood thinking, I'm going to help women, right? And then you realize that the majority of the people coming in are not women, but children, right? So the majority of girls that came in were ages like 15 to 17 years old, or 15 to 18 years old. The youngest I ever saw was 12. And the reason the 12-year-old came in was because her mother brought her in for birth control because her pediatrician wouldn't put her on birth control. So she came to Planned Parenthood. And the reasoning her mother wanted her on birth control, because I thought it was odd, she was 12 years old. And the reason her mother gave us for wanting to put her on birth control is she said she didn't want her daughter to ever get raped and then become pregnant. So that was the youngest I ever saw. An occasional 13 or 14-year-old, that wasn't really common, but definitely 15, 16, 17, 18. And the problem with that is that you're seeing these young girls who are living very promiscuous lives. And so like you mentioned, we need to have these conversations about human sexuality. And what's happening at these family planning centers is that there is a market being created. This is all has to do with a market for abortion. Like you're creating the market so that these young girls have a need for abortion to begin with. We want to eliminate all sense of morality when it comes to human sexuality, and definitely obliterate any sense of self-worth. that you deserve better than being objectified and objectifying one another. Because it's not just the young girls who are being objectified by the boys, but it's also, the girls that are objectifying the boys, right? And vice versa, the boys versus girls. And so we were seeing that, and it was something that I just couldn't quite put my finger on and say, I have an issue with this, but it was unsettling to me. It was unsettling to me because when you looked at their healthcare charts, and you realize these are, 15, 16-year-old girls who already have 3 or more sexual partners in a short amount of time. The promiscuity was rampant. And I was really shocked, genuinely shocked by that, because I couldn't understand and wrap my brain around that type of behavior, that type of promiscuity. And I thought, there's something wrong here. And I just couldn't quite connect the dots. But in my soul, I knew something was wrong. And I think part of that too was because I had been in an abusive relationship that was not just physical, emotional, psychological, but also sexually abusive. And I had been used and objectified as well. And to see these young girls kind of going through that same toxic relationship with the young men in their lives, it hurt me because I knew that there was a better way. I knew that God did not design us, inherently, I just knew. It's like, we're not designed for this, right? But yet here I was day after day championing these young girls and really, saying, good for you, right? Because you're taking responsibility. They don't have to have parental consent to go into a Planned Parenthood and get on birth control. Which is insane to me because you could think about it. Your 14, 15-year-old girl can't go into the pediatrician and just decide what type of medical procedure they want. But they can go into a Planned Parenthood and get an IUD or get an injection or whatever they're doing, right? And they don't have to have parental consent, and their parents don't have to know about it. So you see those type of things. And then, for example, one of the things that really broke my heart was the 17-year-old girl who kept coming in with repeated infections, STDs. So she had a chlamydia, and then she would treat her. We treated her, she left. She'd come back a few months later, she had chlamydia again. We treated her, she'd come back another month later, she had chlamydia again. So up to 3 times I remember her coming in. That she had been infected, treated, reinfected again. So clearly her boyfriend was unfaithful to her. And it broke my heart because I just wanted to look at her and just shake her and just tell her, you deserve better than this. You deserve better than this. You were not created for this, right? And so you see that and it breaks your heart. But I really didn't know how to respond. And I didn't really have the ability to articulate what I was seeing, what was again, connecting the dots, but it was unsettling inside my soul. So what changed? Obviously, I'm going through the motions, thinking that I'm doing good work, justifying and rationalizing all the things that I was dealing with day in and day out there at Planned Parenthood. And going into the 3rd year of working for Planned Parenthood, God got my attention. And it's incredible when I think back during this time, and especially right now that we're in the spring campaign, because it's during the spring Lenten campaign that my conversion happened. This is my favorite time of year, but it also brings a lot of memories, some good and some bad, but mostly great because God is great and He did great things. But I remember in December of 2010, so it was kind of the end of my 2nd year at Planned Parenthood going into my 3rd year, I had left work really frustrated about some changes that were happening administratively, and I left to go finish up some last-minute Christmas shopping. And I was driving around our local Walmart, looking for somewhere to park. And as I was driving around, I was just flipping through the radio stations. And I can't tell you what I was looking for. I can't tell you why I just kept changing this dial, just changing it. And then I went from the FM to the AM, and I would say, this is how you know it was the work of the Holy Spirit, because I don't know about you, but who flips over to the AM for anything? And so I switched over to the AM, and it landed on our local Catholic radio network out of Dallas and Fort Worth. I had no idea that specifically, obviously there's all these Christian radio stations and media, but I had no idea that there was a specifically Catholic radio station. So that was I was really surprised by that. After, they gave the intro, they immediately came on to the programming, and there were women calling in who were talking about their abortions. And I was like, whoa, wait a second. So I turned off the ignition and I sat in the parking lot for over an hour listening to the programming. Obviously, it was in Texas, so I wasn't like going to get hypothermia or anything. So I'm sitting, in the car and I'm listening to it. But what really struck me with all of the women who were calling in, and obviously, they were calling in anonymously and sharing their tragic stories of their past abortions. But one of the common themes that I kept hearing from these women were that they all felt as if they had no choice. They all stated that, I felt that if someone had just offered me a different choice, I may not have gone through with my abortion. What also surprised me was the fact that these were Christian women who had had abortions. I had no idea that Christian women had abortions. I had never met anyone in my personal circle who had ever had one until you get into pro-life work, and then everyone wants to share their story with you, which is quite incredible to me to think about that now. But I didn't know anyone, in my family or in my personal circle who had had an abortion. So to hear these women who were Christians, right, that were talking about their past abortions, I was surprised because I thought, gosh, I thought only atheists or pagans, right, could possibly have an abortion, because how can you have an abortion but believe in God, right? So I was struck by that and listening to their heartbreaking stories. And I remember going home, and just really trying to process all of that. And the other thing that was common is that they all said they felt like they were being treated like cattle, just moved in and moved out very quickly. Like they were just trying to get them in and out as fast as possible. And then every woman had a similar story. And so that kind of resonated with me too, because I thought, yeah, this is how we treat women at our facility, right? Like we're doing everything we can to pack the schedule, fill it up, move them in, move them out. Like you're not really spending quality time with these young girls. And I thought this was supposed to be healthcare, right? But how can you have healthcare when you're not really genuinely spending time with your quote unquote patient? And then you quickly realize these aren't patients, they're clients. It's all about numbers. So I remember going home that evening and just really trying to process what I had heard. And that was kind of that first moment, that catalyst that set everything into motion. Little did I know, what was awaiting me after that. And so I was driving to work, to and from 3 days a week, listening to Catholic radio. And Christmas and New Year's came and went, and I'm just like listening. And every time I turned on the radio, they were talking about the sanctity of human life and the defense of life from conception to natural death. And they were arguing against abortion and making arguments against euthanasia and all of these other life issues that I had really never heard discussions on before. And I'm just kind of processing it. And yet the whole time I'm still thinking to myself, but that's happening over there. I'm working here. Like I was seeing it, that I was like in this gray area, not so black and white, right? The reality is life and death is black and white, right? There is no gray. And so I wanted to believe that I was living in the gray. And I was still rationalizing and justifying my job with Planned Parenthood. Then there would be another bombshell that would happen in mid-January of 2011. And that is when Live Action, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Lila Rose and Live Action, but Live Action is really known for their undercover investigative work, okay? And they had released a expose of undercover videos revealing and showing Planned Parenthood workers across the US willing to aid and abet in underage sex trafficking. And when those videos were released, the president and CEO of Planned Parenthood Federation of America, she went on, national media outlets and just said what they always say when they get caught, which is these are highly edited, doctored videos, things like that this isn't real. And, but she would promise that they would train their staff across the country on how to identify this type of abuse and how to report this type of abuse. And I thought, okay, great. So like they do care about these issues. except for I attended one of those quote-unquote retrainings. And it was during that retraining that they pulled down the projector screen and they started rolling tape and the film from these undercover investigative videos. And I thought it was kind of like, oh, we're gonna show you what not to do, right, as a Planned Parenthood employee. But instead, they were training us on how to not get caught. That was what the training was. Because I had raised my hand and asked the question, what do I do as a clinic manager to bring back policies and procedures and train my staff on what to do if this really happened? Like, I get it, these are actors and they're investigating undercover, whatever, but what if it really happens? It's not far-fetched. We had instances of statutory rape frequently. So it wasn't far-fetched that this really could happen, right? That someone would be coming in, bringing a young girl who was being trafficked, and I needed to know what to do if that really happened. And that's when she told me, Ramona, we're not here to discuss that. We're here to train you on how to identify if someone is coming in undercover, if they're videotaping, if they're recording, and trying to trap you in any way. And I couldn't believe my ears. I was completely disgusted. And I knew that now everything that I'd heard to that point about all the ways in which Planned Parenthood was horrible was true. Only I didn't know what to do.